Imagine discovering that your nation's most valuable resource, the very uranium buried beneath your feet, is financing golden chandeliers and champagne fountains in a Palm Beach mansion, while your people die from preventable diseases. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how a 40-year-old African president uncovered one of the most audacious money laundering schemes in modern history, and why his discovery threatens to unravel decades of silent theft across an entire continent. The evening call to prayer echoed through Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré sat across from his intelligence chief in the presidential office. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Sahelian heat, but it wasn't the temperature that made Colonel Zongrana's hands tremble as he placed a tablet on the mahogany desk between them. "Mr. Dehi, President, this came through our cyber surveillance unit an hour ago," Zongrana whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of machinery and the distant buzz of motorcycle taxis navigating the dusty streets below. Ibrahim leaned forward, his military instincts immediately sharpening. He'd known Zongrana for 15 years, had watched this man coordinate operations against armed insurgents in the Sahel without so much as a bead of sweat. Whatever was on that screen had shaken a man who'd stared down death countless times. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward with the gravity of secrets about to be revealed. The document displayed on the tablet was partially redacted, watermarked with classification stamps Ibrahim recognized from his intelligence training years ago. But what he could see made his blood run cold. Financial transactions, millions of dollars moving through Lomé and Abidjan before finally landing in accounts connected to real estate developments in Florida. The numbers jumped out at him like accusations: 47 million here, 83 million there. These were figures that could transform entire provinces in Burkina Faso, build hospitals, fund schools for a generation. "These funds originate from our uranium deposits in the Sahel," Zongrana continued, his finger scrolling through bank routing numbers and transaction codes that painted a damning picture. Ibrahim's jaw tightened as he recognized the mining concession codes, licenses his government had revoked 6 months earlier when they discovered the previous administration had sold them for pennies on the dollar while the people starved. Now, those same resources, that same national wealth, was financing golden bathroom fixtures and crystal chandeliers halfway across the world. But here's what made this discovery even more shocking. The sophistication of the operation suggested this wasn't just about one corrupt businessman. This was systematic, coordinated, protected by networks that spanned continents and generations. "How did we intercept this?" Ibrahim asked, his mind already racing through the implications. If they'd found this, what else was hidden? Zongrana explained that a junior analyst, a young woman fresh from university, had flagged unusual encrypted communications between a Ouagadougou business address and servers in the United States. The encryption was military-grade, the kind that suggested state-level resources behind the operation. When the cyber team finally cracked it after weeks of work, they found not just financial records, but photographs, guest lists, detailed correspondence, and a paper trail that led to places Ibrahim never imagined. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. A businessman Ibrahim had met once, briefly, at a West African Economic Summit 3 years ago. The man had smiled too much, promised investment in infrastructure and job creation, then vanished like smoke when Ibrahim's government took power and began asking uncomfortable questions about where previous investments had actually gone. Ibrahim stood and walked to the window, watching the sun set over the red earth of his nation. 40 years old, barely 2 years into leading his country, and already facing a conspiracy that stretched across oceans and threatened to destabilize everything they'd built. He thought of the young soldiers who'd stood with him during the transition, the mothers who'd wept with joy when they announced free health care for children under 5, the farmers who'd finally received subsidies to compete with cheap imports flooding West African markets. "Convene the Security Council," he said quietly, turning back to Zongrana with steel hardening in his eyes. "Tonight, And, Colonel, prepare a full investigative team. I want our best economists, our top cyber specialists, everyone we trust. If our resources are funding foreign luxuries while our children lack school books, someone will answer for it. The encrypted file glowed on the tablet screen, a digital Pandora's box that would change everything. But neither man could have predicted just how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how many powerful people would fight to keep it buried. The investigation team worked through the night in a secure room deep beneath the presidential complex. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on maps and financial charts that covered every available wall surface. Ibrahim had assembled his most trusted advisors, 3 former military officers who'd proven their loyalty during the coup, 2 economists who'd studied at African universities and refused lucrative positions abroad, and a tech specialist named Lieutenant Sawadogo who'd trained in Dakar before returning home to serve his country. Coffee grew cold in plastic cups as they pieced together a puzzle that seemed impossible at first glance. The more they dug, the more elaborate the scheme became. The trail led to Mar-a-Lago, a palatial estate in Palm Beach, Florida, where extravagant events attracted billionaires and power brokers from around the world. The photographs recovered from the encrypted files showed crystal chandeliers the size of automobiles, gold-trimmed walls that reflected light like mirrors, guests in designer suits whose individual net worth exceeded Burkina Faso's entire annual budget. Each event reportedly cost more than what Ibrahim's government spent monthly on rural health care across 3 provinces. The contradiction burned in Ibrahim's chest like swallowed fire. While his people chose between buying medicine and feeding their children, stolen wealth financed ice sculptures and champagne pyramids for the global elite. "This ballroom hosts private fundraisers, Mr. President," explained Aminata Diallo, the lead economist, her finger tracing a timeline on the digital display. "Our intelligence shows at least 4 major events in the past 18 months, each requiring significant upfront investment for reservations, catering, entertainment, and security. But here's where it gets truly sophisticated. The money didn't flow directly from Burkina Faso to Florida. That would be too obvious, too easily traceable for operators of this caliber. Instead, it moved through an intricate network of shell companies registered in Delaware, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. One company would invoice another for vague consulting services, which would then pay a third entity for marketing research, which finally deposited funds into accounts controlled by event organizers and real estate developers. The uranium extracted from Burkina Faso's soil, torn from the ground by workers earning dollars a day, became nothing more than digits on computer screens. Those digits then transformed into champagne pyramids, golden fixtures, and political influence for people who'd never set foot in Africa and couldn't locate Burkina Faso on a map if their lives depended on it. Ibrahim felt his people's poverty being laundered into someone else's prestige, and the realization made him sick with rage. Lieutenant Sawadogo pulled up satellite images showing the mining sites in northern Burkina Faso, barren landscapes scarred by extraction equipment. "The concessions were granted in 2019, sir, under President Kabore's administration," he explained, highlighting areas where foreign companies had operated with minimal oversight and even less accountability. The contracts were masterpieces of legal exploitation. 90% of profits left the country immediately, routed through tax havens and corporate structures designed specifically to avoid any obligation to the Burkinabe people. Meanwhile, communities near the mines struggled with contaminated water supplies, respiratory illnesses from dust, and the collapse of traditional agriculture as mining operations destroyed farmland. When Ibrahim's government canceled these contracts after taking power, declaring them crimes against the nation, the companies had sued for hundreds of millions in lost future earnings. They'd hired lawyers from London and New York, filed cases in international arbitration courts designed to favor corporations over countries, and threatened to seize Burkina Faso's foreign assets. Now the evidence suggested something even more damning. They'd simply continued operations illegally, smuggling uranium through Niger and Mali with the help of corrupt officials who'd been paid to look the other way. The ballroom glittered on one screen, the desolate mining landscape on another. Two worlds, connected by greed and protected by silence. Ibrahim studied the guest lists from the Mar-a-Lago events carefully. Names he recognized from international news appeared alongside others completely unknown to him. Politicians, businessmen, socialites, all mingling in golden rooms paid for with African poverty. But one name appeared at every single gathering, never missing an event. Richard Kessler, described in the documents as a mining investment consultant with business interests across West Africa. But the investigation revealed that Kessler wasn't the source of the funds. He was merely the conduit, the well-dressed middleman who made dirty money look respectable. He was the man who could walk into exclusive clubs and presidential fundraisers without raising suspicion, the perfect launderer for wealth stolen from people an ocean away. "Find me everything on Kessler," Ibrahim ordered, his voice cutting through the room's tense silence like a blade. "Bank records, travel history, business partnerships, family connections, every person he's ever met for coffee. I want to know what he eats for breakfast and where he buys his shoes." Aminata nodded, her fingers already flying across her laptop keyboard. The ballroom connection was clear now, a golden thread leading from African soil to American luxury. But who held the other end of that thread? Who was the architect of this betrayal? And most importantly, how high did this conspiracy reach? The answers would come sooner than anyone expected, and they would shake Ibrahim's faith in humanity to its core. Richard Kessler's file arrived on Ibrahim's desk at dawn, delivered by a courier who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The dossier was thick, smelling of fresh printer ink, and it revealed a life built entirely on shadows and exploitation. The man was 62 years old, born in Brussels to a Belgian mother and American father. He'd been educated at Sciences Po in Paris, that prestigious institution that had produced so many of Africa's exploiters wrapped in diplomatic credentials. Kessler had built his career in what he called resource acquisition, which was apparently polite terminology for stripping nations of their wealth while claiming to bring development and opportunity. His photograph showed a silver-haired man with expensive glasses and the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Everything about him screamed respectability, from his tailored suits to his fluent French to his memberships in exclusive clubs across 3 continents. But the file told a different story. Kessler had operated across 14 African countries over 3 decades, and his pattern was always the same. He appeared shortly after coups or political transitions, when governments were weak and desperate for legitimacy. He offered development partnerships and foreign investment, promising jobs and infrastructure. Then, somehow, the nations he'd helped always ended up poorer than before, their resources flowing north while debt mounted and corruption scandals emerged. He'd been in Ouagadougou 3 years ago, dining with ministers who now lived in exile or faced corruption charges in Burkina Faso courts. Ibrahim remembered hearing his name whispered in military circles back then, always with a certain unease. People called him the Ghost, a man who materialized when governments were vulnerable and vanished before anyone could connect him to the devastation left behind. The breakthrough in understanding Kessler's role came from an unexpected source that would prove how powerful simple courage can be in the face of systematic corruption. A phone call reached the presidential office from a woman in Abidjan. Her name was Marguerite Dubois, 74 years old, a former French diplomat who'd served in West Africa for 3 decades before retiring to Ivory Coast. "Mr. President, I've been following your investigation in the news," she said, her French accent thick but her voice steady with purpose and barely contained urgency. "I know Richard Kessler. I know what he does, and, more importantly, I know who he works for." Ibrahim's chief of staff had almost dismissed the call as another conspiracy theorist seeking attention. They'd received dozens of such calls since news of the investigation leaked. But something in Marguerite's tone demanded attention. She wasn't hysterical or grandiose. She was calm, factual, and clearly frightened of something. She agreed to meet in person, insisting the conversation happen face-to-face, away from phones that could be monitored and digital surveillance that had become so sophisticated it could track conversations across continents. 2 days later, Ibrahim sat across from Marguerite in a secure government guest house in Ouagadougou, ceiling fans rotating slowly overhead, creating the only sound in a room thick with anticipation. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a weathered leather folder containing documents she'd kept hidden for 15 years, waiting for someone brave enough to use them. "I was France's deputy ambassador to Burkina Faso in 2009, she began, her hand steady as she opened the folder with the care of someone handling evidence in a trial. "That's when I first encountered the network. French intelligence services, American business interests, and local collaborators working together to control your uranium and ensure it never truly benefited your people." She'd witnessed classified meetings where Kessler brokered deals between Western mining companies and corrupt African officials, ensuring resources flowed north while profits never touched African soil. When she reported her concerns to Paris, documenting everything she'd seen, she was quietly reassigned to a meaningless position. Then came the pressure, subtle at first, then increasingly direct, until she accepted early retirement to avoid being completely destroyed. "Kessler doesn't work alone, Mr. President," Marguerite continued, sliding photographs across the table toward Ibrahim with a trembling hand. "He never has. He's the front man. But behind him stands someone far more dangerous." The images showed Kessler at various locations: Bamako, Conakry, Niamey, always accompanied by the same figure, a black man in immaculately tailored suits whose face made Ibrahim's breath catch in his throat as past and present collided with devastating force. "That's Etienne Ouedraogo," Ibrahim whispered, feeling the air leave his lungs. Ouedraogo was Burkina a mining magnate who'd made his fortune under Blaise Compaoré's regime before acquiring French citizenship and relocating to Monaco. He'd been untouchable for decades, protected by networks that spanned continents and included politicians, bankers, and intelligence services on 3 continents. "He's your man, Mr. President," Marguerite said quietly, watching Ibrahim's face harden with recognition and fury. "Etienne Ouedraogo has been bleeding Burkina Faso dry for 20 years, and now he's using your uranium to buy influence in American politics, to fund events and campaigns, to ensure that no matter who wins elections in Washington or Paris, his interests remain protected." The room fell silent except for the ceiling fan's gentle rotation. Ibrahim stared at Ouedraogo's photograph, at the expensive suit and confident smile, at the face of a man who'd grown wealthy by betraying his own people. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, announcing the dawn of a day that would change everything. Etienne Ouedraogo's story was written in the red dust of Burkina Faso and the marble floors of Monaco, a tale of betrayal that spanned 2 continents and multiple generations of suffering. Born in Koudougou in 1968, he'd grown up during the revolutionary years of Thomas Sankara, watching his country dream of self-sufficiency and dignity under a president who rode a bicycle and preached that debt was modern slavery. But where Sankara saw liberation and possibility, young Etienne saw only opportunity in the chaos that would inevitably follow. When Sankara was assassinated in 1987, killed by men who couldn't tolerate his vision of African independence, Etienne aligned himself immediately with Blaise Compaoré's new regime. He became the smiling face who negotiated mining contracts with foreign companies desperate for uranium to fuel their nuclear programs. By 30, he owned 3 mining operations. By 40, he'd relocated his wealth to European banks and rarely set foot in his homeland except when absolutely necessary for appearances. The people of Burkina Faso worked in his mines for dollars a day, breathing toxic dust and drinking contaminated water, while Ouedraogo collected millions in Monaco's tax-free paradise. He sent his children to Swiss boarding schools while Burkinabe children studied under trees because schools had no roofs. He wore watches worth more than most of his countrymen would earn in their entire lives. Ibrahim's investigators discovered that Ouedraogo maintained a phantom presence in West Africa through an elaborate network of proxies and shell companies bearing deliberately innocuous names designed to deflect scrutiny. Sahel Development Corporation, West African Growth Partners, Harmattan Resources. Each one registered in different jurisdictions, each one designed to obscure the money trail like layers of sediment hiding fossils from view. The uranium extracted from Burkina Faso's northern regions moved through these corporate veils, its origins deliberately confused through false documentation and bribed customs officials who stamped papers without asking questions they'd been paid not to ask. Ouedraogo had perfected the art of extraction, not just of minerals, but of national wealth itself, transforming his country's birthright into personal fortune, while convincing the world he was a legitimate businessman bringing development to Africa. His dual citizenship gave him diplomatic protection that made him nearly invincible. His French passport meant he could operate freely throughout Europe, attending galas and sitting on corporate boards. His Burkinabe identity provided access to African resources and the ability to claim he was somehow helping his people by creating jobs, even though those jobs paid starvation wages and destroyed communities. The connection to the ballroom emerged through Ouedraogo's American ambitions, which had grown over the past decade as he'd sought to expand his influence beyond Africa and Europe. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with Republican power brokers and real estate developers, attending events, making donations, becoming part of networks where money bought access and access bought protection. Financial records painstakingly reconstructed by Ibrahim's team showed that Ouedraogo had funneled approximately $140 million through Richard Kessler's network over 3 years. Money laundered so thoroughly, passed through so many legitimate-appearing transactions that it appeared as clean investment capital by the time it reached American accounts. The funds supported various political events, property developments, and luxury ventures that burnished certain political images while buying influence and access at the highest levels. Ouedraogo understood something fundamental about American politics. It ran on money, and he had resources most politicians only dreamed of accessing. His calculation was brutally simple. Invest in power today, secure mining concessions and political protection tomorrow. Spend millions now to make billions later. But Ouedraogo had made one critical mistake in his decades of exploitation. He'd underestimated the young military leader who'd taken control of Burkina Faso in 2022. Ibrahim Traoré represented everything Etienne had left behind and learned to despise: loyalty to country over personal gain, commitment to the people over foreign approval, refusal to sell national dignity for a Swiss bank account. "Get me the prosecutor general," Ibrahim told his team, studying Ouedraogo's photograph with cold fury. The expensive suit, the confident smile, the gold watch that cost more than a rural teacher's annual salary. Prepare arrest warrants, asset seizure orders, and international cooperation requests. I want every agency informed. His voice carried the weight of generations who'd been robbed, exploited, murdered, and told they were too backward to govern themselves. Etienne Ouedraogo fled Burkina Faso with our wealth, Ibrahim continued, his jaw set with determination. But he's still our citizen, and he will answer for what he's stolen, even if we have to drag him back from Monaco in chains. The financial investigation team transformed a conference room into what they called the War Room, with walls covered in flowcharts mapping money's journey across 3 continents like a spider's web of corruption. Lead investigator Fatou Diallo, a forensic accountant who'd trained with Interpol in Lyon and refused six-figure offers from international firms to return home and serve her country, stood before the largest chart explaining the labyrinth Ouédraogo had constructed. "Mr. President, this is the most sophisticated laundering operation I've encountered in 20 years of investigating financial crimes," she said, her laser pointer tracing red lines between corporations that existed only on paper. Most criminals make mistakes out of greed or impatience. But Ouédraogo built this system with the patience of someone who expected it to last generations. The money began in Burkina Faso's uranium mines, officially declared as consulting fees, paid to a Luxembourg holding company called Minro Africa SA. The fees were technically legal, hidden within hundreds of other legitimate transactions, just another line item that no auditor would question without cause to dig deeper. From Luxembourg, the funds transferred to a Delaware LLC named Atlantic Strategic Advisors, which existed only as a registered agent address and a post office box in Wilmington. Delaware had become the preferred destination for shell companies precisely because it asked few questions and maintained secrecy that rivaled Switzerland. Atlantic Strategic Advisors had no employees, no office, no operations beyond receiving and transferring money according to instructions from anonymous beneficial owners. Each transfer stayed just below reporting thresholds, amounts carefully calculated to avoid triggering international banking alerts that might draw scrutiny. Someone had done their homework, understanding exactly how much money could move without raising red flags at banks or financial intelligence units monitoring for money laundering. Atlantic Strategic Advisors then paid for marketing services to a Cayman Islands entity called Global Prestige Events, the company that directly contracted with Mar-a-Lago for ballroom reservations, event management, catering, and entertainment. The Cayman company's directors were nominee shareholders, paid figureheads with no actual control or knowledge of operations, while beneficial ownership remained hidden behind attorney-client privilege that made it nearly impossible to penetrate. They used the exact same structure drug cartels employ, Fatou explained, showing Ibrahim bank statements with timestamps and routing numbers that told a damning story. Money enters dirty, passes through enough legitimate-looking transactions, and emerges clean on the other side. The uranium's value, initially around $200 million, had been reduced through fake expenses and inflated service fees to roughly $140 million by the time it reached American accounts. But here's what made this case even more shocking. The missing $60 million hadn't simply vanished. It had paid bribes to officials across multiple countries, bought silence from potential whistleblowers, compensated the financial architects who designed this invisible pipeline, and funded security operations to protect the network from exposure. Ibrahim's team had obtained the records through a combination of leaked documents from inside Ouédraogo's organization, whistleblower testimony from people whose consciences finally outweighed their fear, and cooperation from banking regulators in 3 countries who'd grown suspicious of repetitive transaction patterns that didn't match stated business purposes. One junior compliance officer in Luxembourg had flagged Minro Africa SA after noticing its reported revenue exceeded the entire GDP of some African nations it claimed to do business with. Her report had been buried by senior management with connections to the company, but she'd kept copies, waiting years for someone who'd listen and actually act on the information. This woman risked her career, maybe her life, to help us, Ibrahim said quietly, reading her testimony. She'd written about the pressure she'd faced, the subtle threats, the suggestion that asking questions might affect her future employment prospects. But she'd kept documenting everything anyway, creating an insurance policy that would eventually help bring down the network she'd discovered. The paper trail she'd preserved was meticulous: wire transfers with originating and receiving bank details, corporate registry documents showing ownership structures, email correspondence between Kessler and Ouédraogo discussing the Florida investment with shocking frankness, encrypted messages they'd believed were secure, but which good technology and patient effort had finally cracked. The most damning evidence came from Ouedraogo's own arrogance and his apparent belief that his fortress of shell companies made him invincible. He'd kept detailed records of everything, apparently planning to use the information as leverage if anyone ever moved against him. He'd documented meetings, recorded phone calls, saved every email and text message. Encrypted communications recovered from a seized server showed him directing specific payments, approving guest lists for Mar-a-Lago events, even discussing which American politicians needed encouragement through strategic donations. In one message, he boasted about his influence. "I can make phone calls that presidents answer. I can open doors that stay closed to entire nations. This is power worth every dollar we've invested." He documented his own crimes, Ibrahim observed, reading messages where Ouedraogo described his network's reach with pride. He was so confident in his protection that he wrote everything down. Fatou nodded, explaining that Ouedraogo had archived everything meticulously, organizing it like a businessman proud of his accomplishments rather than a criminal trying to hide evidence. "He built his own prison, Mr. President," she said. "Now we just need to put him in it." The paper trail was complete, irrefutable, a financial confession written in wire transfers and corporate documents that would hold up in any court that valued evidence over political influence. The question now was whether Ibrahim had the courage to use it against opponents far more powerful than Burkina Faso. The emergency cabinet meeting convened at 6 in the morning in the presidential situation room. Ministers arriving in darkness with faces etched in concern and exhaustion. Word had spread that Ibrahim had discovered something significant, something that would test everything they'd built since taking power. Defense Minister Apollinaire Koné entered last, his military boots echoing on the tile floor as he took his seat beside the foreign minister, his expression grim. "Gentlemen," Ibrahim began, sitting at the head of the table with the complete investigative file stacked before him like evidence at a trial, "what I am about to share will test everything we've built since taking power. It will test our courage, our unity, and our commitment to the principles we claimed to fight for." He distributed folders containing executive summaries, enough detail to inform without overwhelming, and watched their faces change as they absorbed the implications. The room filled with the sound of pages turning and sharp intakes of breath as ministers read about uranium-funding ballrooms, about shell companies and laundered millions, about a son of Burkina Faso living in Monaco luxury while his countrymen died from preventable diseases. Foreign Minister Rasmata Ouattara looked up first, her eyes wide with recognition and dawning horror. "Ouedraogo," she whispered, the name carrying decades of suppressed anger and frustration. Everyone at this table knew that name, had watched him operate with impunity for years, protected by French politicians and corporate interests that valued stability over justice. "We have 3 options," Ibrahim continued, standing to face his cabinet as morning light began filtering through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. "First, we pursue this quietly through diplomatic channels, requesting extradition and hoping international cooperation materializes despite Western economic interests that benefit from the current system." Heads shook around the table before he even finished. They'd all witnessed how justice disappeared when powerful nations protected their allies, how evidence vanished and witnesses recanted under pressure, how crimes against African nations somehow never quite rose to the level requiring action. Second, we release everything publicly and immediately. Let international media and public pressure force accountability. Make this so visible that powerful people can't sweep it under the rug without appearing complicit. Finance Minister Boubacar Traoré leaned forward at this, his economist's mind already calculating the financial fallout. "They'll destroy us economically," he said bluntly. "France will cut aid. The IMF will withdraw support. American banks will freeze our accounts. We could face sanctions that cripple our economy within months. Third," Ibrahim continued, his voice hardening, "we use this information strategically, negotiating debt forgiveness and better trade terms in exchange for our discretion. We play the game the way they've taught us to play it, using leverage to benefit our people even if it means letting Ouedraogo walk free. The room fell silent as each minister wrestled with conscience versus pragmatism, justice versus national interest, principles versus survival. The ceiling fans rotated overhead, their gentle sound the only movement in a room where the future of Burkina Faso hung in balance. Defense Minister Kone spoke first, his military directness cutting through the tension like a machete through undergrowth. Mr. President, if we stay silent, we become complicit in the very corruption we overthrew the previous government for tolerating. He'd fought alongside Ibrahim during the transition, had seen young soldiers die defending a vision of Burkina Faso free from foreign exploitation and domestic betrayal. Our people didn't sacrifice so we could play the same games as those who came before. They died believing we were different, that we actually meant what we said about sovereignty and dignity. Others nodded in agreement, but Rasmata raised a cautious hand, her 20 years in diplomacy demanding voice. We must consider the consequences carefully. France, the United States, the mining consortiums, they will mobilize against us with everything they have. She'd spent 2 decades watching how quickly international support could evaporate when powerful interests felt threatened. They'll freeze our accounts, sanction our exports, fund opposition groups to destabilize us. We could face another coup within months. They've done it before to leaders who challenge their interests. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. The list is long and bloody. Ibrahim walked to the window overlooking Ouagadougou, watching the city awaken to another day of struggle and hope. Market women were already setting up their stalls, displaying vegetables and goods with practiced efficiency. Motorcycle taxis were beginning their daily dance through traffic, weaving between cars and pedestrians with death-defying skill. Children in school uniforms walked red dirt paths toward education that might lift them from poverty. I became president to serve them, not to protect those who robbed them, he said, turning back to face his cabinet with conviction burning in his eyes. We go public, completely, transparently, with every document, every transaction, every name, no redactions, no diplomatic language that softens the truth. His voice rose with the conviction that had carried him through revolution and sustained him through 2 years of fighting entrenched corruption. Let the world see how African resources finance foreign luxuries while our people lack clean water. Let them see exactly who profits from our poverty and who protects them, and let history judge whether we had the courage to speak truth when silence would have been safer. Minister Kone stood in solidarity, his chair scraping against the floor. Then Bubachar rose despite his concerns about economic consequences. Then, one by one, the entire cabinet stood, a room full of men who'd chosen principle over pragmatism, justice over personal survival. Then we stand together, Mr. President, Rasmata said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear everyone could see in her eyes. Whatever comes, we face it united. The decision was made. Truth over safety, justice over convenience, their people's dignity over their own political survival. In that moment, they all understood they might be signing their own death warrants. But sometimes, courage means standing up, even when you know the cost. The response came within hours of Burkina Faso's announcement that President Traoré would address the nation regarding matters of national sovereignty and resource theft. The speed of the reaction told Ibrahim everything he needed to know about how closely they'd been watching, how seriously they took the threat. The French ambassador requested an urgent meeting, arriving at the presidential palace with 2 attachés and a briefcase full of diplomatic warnings wrapped in polite language. Ambassador Philippe Marchand carried himself with the practiced superiority of someone accustomed to African leaders bowing to European pressure. Mr. President, Paris is deeply concerned about unsubstantiated allegations that could damage bilateral relations built over decades, Marchand said, his tone carrying barely concealed threat beneath the diplomatic veneer. France has been a friend to Burkina Faso for many years. It would be unfortunate if unfounded accusations jeopardized that friendship. Ibrahim received him standing, deliberately refusing the customary tea that would signal this was a friendly conversation between allies. "Ambassador, when did documented financial crimes become unsubstantiated allegations?" Ibrahim replied, his arms crossed as he watched Marchand shift uncomfortably. "I have bank records, wire transfers, corporate documents, testimony from witnesses. What exactly is unsubstantiated?" The ambassador's expression hardened. "These matters are complex and require proper legal process through appropriate channels. Making inflammatory statements could have serious consequences for Burkina Faso's international standing and economic relationships." The threat was clear, even wrapped in diplomatic language: stay silent or face punishment. The American embassy followed with a tersely worded statement expressing reservations about inflammatory accusations without proper legal process that could undermine regional stability and investor confidence. The machinery of Western diplomatic pressure had activated with remarkable speed and coordination, mobilizing resources across multiple governments faster than most humanitarian responses to African crises. Within 24 hours, corporate lawyers descended on Ouagadougou like locusts, representing mining companies, financial institutions, and unnamed interested parties who demanded meetings with government officials. They occupied hotel suites in the city's few luxury establishments, working phones and laptops around the clock to construct legal defenses and public relations strategies designed to confuse and deflect. Ibrahim's justice minister reported receiving calls from law firms in London, New York, and Geneva threatening lawsuits that could bankrupt the nation. "They're offering settlements, Mr. President," Justice Minister Sankara explained during an afternoon briefing, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Debt, forgiveness, infrastructure investment, development funds." One firm even suggested a $500 million package for Burkina Faso in exchange for dropping the investigation and issuing a statement about misunderstandings. Ibrahim's laugh was bitter, hollow, the sound of someone who'd seen too much cynicism. "They're trying to bribe us with a fraction of what they've already stolen. $500 million when they've taken billions over decades, and they expect us to be grateful?" But the real pressure came through financial channels. Subtle but devastating for a nation dependent on international banking systems to conduct trade and receive aid. Burkina Faso's sovereign bonds dropped 12% in 2 days as credit rating agencies issued warnings about political instability and unpredictable governance that threatened investor confidence. The IMF postponed a scheduled review of development loans, citing the need for clarification on recent allegations and their potential impact on economic policy. European banks that processed Burkina Faso's international transactions began delaying transfers, claiming compliance reviews that somehow only affected Burkinabe accounts while other nations' transactions processed normally. Ibrahim's economic team warned that if the pressure continued, the country could face a liquidity crisis within weeks that would make it impossible to pay government salaries or import essential goods. "They're choking us financially," Finance Minister Boubacar reported grimly, showing charts of frozen assets and delayed payments that painted a stark picture. "The message is clear: back down or watch your economy collapse and your people starve." Meanwhile, social media erupted with coordinated disinformation campaigns that bore all the hallmarks of professional psychological operations. Bot networks amplified carefully crafted messages attacking Ibrahim's credibility. Paid influencers spread conspiracy theories about his mental state, his motives, his secret alliances with unknown,